Welcome back to Proxim, everybody, and today we're going to be looking at a Craftworld Eldar Advanced Tactics video covering how to control the board. So this is something that you hear a lot with experienced Eldar players. They talk a lot about Eldar being a faction that needs to control the board to have any sort of success on the battlefield. But for newer players or more intermediate players, you might be wondering, well, how do I exactly do that? It's easier said than done, right? And the response to a lot of veteran players is basically this. Well, you just have to kind of play games. You have to use certain units to be able to control different areas of the board, and you'll learn as you go, right? You'll learn more as you play more. You'll learn kind of what enemy armies are capable of and stuff like that. And while that's certainly true, I do think there's a couple of basics that players need to understand when they're looking to exert board control on an opponent. So my goal for this video is to kind of go over the basics with you guys of what board control is and how to achieve it with your army. And I'm not going to just go into one or two different types of units. I'm going to go into all the different tools that the Craftworld Eldar have to control the board and how to achieve this in your game. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. So a quick overview of the video. We're going to be defining what board control means in Warhammer 40k. We're going to be looking at the Craftworld Eldar tools for helping control the board. And lastly, we're going to be looking at what you need to watch out for and how to position your forces on the battlefield. And included in this is going to be an example of a board in which we're playing one of the missions in Nephilim. And I'm going to show you guys kind of how to position your forces and how to play out the game from there. All right, so what does board control mean in Warhammer 40k? So board control is basically a term used to describe a player's ability to dictate their opponent's movements and actions on the battlefield. Now, this can be very hard for a newer player to understand because, how can we possibly control what our opponent does, right? But there are ways to do it in which basically you're forcing your opponent to make decisions that aren't optimal. And you can do this in a number of ways to basically prevent your opponent from doing what they want to do. And essentially, that's what board control is, right? So a couple of examples of this might be blocking off certain areas of the board or creating a kill zone where if enemies enter, they will be promptly destroyed. So again, your opponent can't move into that area without being destroyed. But at the same time, your opponent can't really just sit there and do nothing or they're going to lose the game, right? So you kind of put your opponent in this lose-lose situation where they can't really make a great decision, and both decisions are going to be to your advantage. Also, other board control tactics can include stuff like debuffing enemy movement, making it harder for enemies to move, denying the witch, so placing your psychers in positions where their psychers are going to have to basically take a denial test to be able to get off their psychic powers. Or I should say they're going to have to beat your deny the witch roll on their own psychic test, so the enemy might not want to go into range of your units, and that might put them out of range of their psychic abilities. And lastly, of course, we have Auspex Scan, which is a bubble around a unit that you can spend command points on to deny enemy reinforcements from coming in by basically shooting at them, getting a free shot at them out of sequence. So that can be another great way of controlling certain areas of the board. So you might be asking, well, what are Craftworld Eldar's tools for helping us control the board? So Forewarned and Deny the Witch, of course, because we have plenty of Psychers in our army that can deny, and we also have a very powerful Forewarned ability, which is essentially an upgraded Auspex Scan. We have Howling Banshees and Fire Dragons and a Wave Serpent. We have the Restrain and Horrify psychic powers, D-cannon support weapons, fast moving and small units like Swooping Hawks and Vipers, and Striking Scorpions and Rangers that can use advanced positions. So first, Forewarned and Deny the Witch. So first of all, in every Eldar army, you're going to have multiple Psychers that can be used to create what I like to call a null zone to make enemy psychic powers harder to use. So as you guys probably know, when an enemy unit casts a psychic power within 24 inches of one of your psychers, you get to make a Deny the Witch test, which is essentially a roll-off. Your opponent rolls 2 dice to try to pass the psychic test. If they pass, you can roll 2 dice and try to beat that result to negate that psychic power. So it's a little harder to do, but it's probably a little bit worse than 50% chances of actually denying something. But the Eldar also have a couple of ways of boosting these tests, which can be really helpful at stopping enemy psychic power. So most likely, your opponent is not going to want to place their models within 24 of your psychers, because that could mean that their psychic test could fail, right? Especially if your enemy is casting multiple psychic powers, they might be in an extreme disadvantage if you have multiple psychers ready to stop those psychic tests. And also, the Forewarned ability can effectively deny 18 inches of enemy reinforcements, and we have plenty of powerful shooting units that can obliterate targets who do end up within 18 inches. So Forewarned is an ability that we can use on a friendly shooting unit, I think within 6 inches of a friendly Farseer, if I'm not mistaken. It may be 12. But if you're within range of that Farseer, and you're within 18 inches of that enemy unit, you can spend 2 command points to shoot at that target. Now, unlike other factions who do get this ability, Eldar have something up their sleeve that not a lot of factions do, and that's Guide. So if you put Guide on something like a squad of 5 Shroud Runners or a squad of Wind Riders or something like that, and when the enemy comes down through reinforcements and you shoot them with the Forewarned ability, you're going to be re-rolling all of your hits, which is fantastic. So most likely, let's say the enemy comes down with the unit of Bloodletters or something like that, you can easily mop up that unit with your Wind Riders or your Shroud Runners or whatever you have Guide on. And that's going to cause one or two things. That's going to cause, A, your opponent to not want to deploy within 18 inches of your unit, which can honestly destroy your enemy's ability to actually engage with you, like in the case of Chaos Demons. Or your opponent's just going to have to give up the unit and deep strike other units within range. So a cool thing to do is, against Chaos Demon players, they're probably going to want to deep strike multiple units in any given turn. So if you have the Forewarned ability, you can basically use it to guarantee that your Shroud Runners are at least going to be able to kill a unit of demons before they go down to a charge. Now, the other cool thing is, if, let's say he comes in with 2 Bloodletter units right next to your unit of Shroud Runners or whatever you got, and you shoot him, first of all, with Forewarned, kill one unit, and then they charge in with the other one. If you have a spare command point, you can use the Wireweave Grenades ability to reduce their charge distance and do D3 wounds. And on top of this, you can also Overwatch for a command point. Now, I know that causes a lot of issues because you have a lot of command point expenditure there. But if you're going against Chaos Demons and you know that they're going to be deep striking multiple units into you, it might be worth it to save some command points for this. Because essentially what that's going to do is that's going to negate your opponent's ability to be able to charge you on any given turn. So very great ability, insane value against Chaos Demons and stuff like that. And I know Chaos Demons have a couple of things where they can, get off insane charge distances out of reserve, and they might catch you in reserve, but not before you kill a couple of units before they do. So keep that in mind when going against enemies who like to deep strike in and tie you up in combat. The next unit that I would like to talk about is Fire Dragons and Howling Banshees in a Wave Serpent. So both of these units can hang back in a Wave Serpent behind some obscuring terrain and have an insane threat range when enemies come close. So a lot of newer players will look at a squad of Howling Banshees and Fire Dragons and say, I want to put up my Wave Serpent and zoom it forward, engage enemy units as fast as I can so that I can kill them, right? And while this is certainly something that worked in past editions, and in fact, I remember playing back in 5th edition where this is exactly what you wanted to do with your Fire Dragons. You wanted to zoom them up, drop them out, kill a tank. That was their job. But now in this edition with objective play and stuff like that, I don't know if that's the best way to use the Fire Dragons and Howling Banshees. And when it comes to board control, I think the better way to use these models is to actually just sit them back and just wait. Just wait, because guess what? This can effectively prevent your opponent from wanting to place their units within their threat range. So when units disembark from a transport, they basically get a 3-inch move. They disembark 3 inches outside of the transport. Fire Dragons themselves have about a 30-inch threat range with the +4 range Exarch power when they disembark from a transport. And Howling Banshees have about a 20-inch threat range, and even more with Strains of Fate. So you can also use Strains of Fate to give them better advance rolls, and because Banshees can assault after advancing, and of course Fire Dragons can shoot after advancing because of battle focus, you have insane amount of threat range. So essentially your opponent is going to have to stay outside of that range if they don't want to die next turn. So this can be another great way to control where your opponent moves and what he moves into range of your units. And then, of course, we have the Restrain and Horrify psychic power. So Restrain halves enemy movement and prevents actions. This is very good for slowing down fast units like Seekers. And honestly, let me tell you, I love casting this ability with a Warlock Skyrunner, because what I can do is I can move up, cast this ability on a slow enemy unit a fast enemy unit like Seekers, slow them down so they can't get a charge off, and then of course retreat back with battle focus or something like that so that my Warlock Skyrunner can't be targeted as easily. Also, Horrify forces enemy units to strike last in combat, effectively preventing them from charging into your melee units. So again, this can be a very powerful denial ability. I had a recent video where I went over this. Basically, you charge your enemy combat unit into something, and then you cast Horrify on a nearby combat unit of your opponent's. And then, if your opponent chooses to charge your Howling Banshees or Striking Scorpions or Shining Spears or whatever, he's going to have to take another round of attacks from that close combat unit, which most likely will end in the destruction of his own unit. So it kind of forces your opponent to make two bad decisions. Neither of them are good, and that will give you the advantage on the field. And of course, what would this video be if I didn't talk about D-Cannons? So D-Cannons are one of those units that a lot of Eldar players are talking about right now because they have extreme board control potential. So essentially, they do disgusting amounts of damage. They're strength 12, AP -4. They have D3 shots apiece, and they ignore line of sight. And with a potential 30-inch threat range, if they move, D-Cannons can make it very unappealing for enemy heavies to get within that range. So just like Howling Banshees deny enemy infantry units from coming within range, D-Cannons can certainly prevent enemy heavy units from coming in range as well. Your enemy is not going to want to place Be'lakor within 30 inches of these D-Cannons because they're going to move up and they are going to absolutely light his shit up. And I'm serious. There's nothing funnier than watching a Be'lakor take 12 or 15 wounds to a unit of D-Cannons like this. Especially if you're running Uthway and you have the Black Guardian stratagem and you have the, I keep forgetting what this is. I think it's called Martial Citizenry, which you get a reroll ones to hit. Something like that. But basically hitting on twos with rerolls. Although I guess against Be'lakor it's at -1. But even so, threes to hit with rerolls of ones. A lot of damage is going to go through there with the mortal wounds. And the fact that Be'lakor really only has a 4+ demonic save against that. You're going to get quite a few in and do some serious damage. So no one wants to get within range of D-Cannons is the bottom line. So if you have these placed right, they can actually deny a large area of the board from your opponent wanting to get in to range. And then we also have fast-moving and small units like Swooping Hawks and Vipers. So Swooping Hawks can remain out of line of sight for most of the game and can appear where the enemy is weakest to take away objectives in the late game and score on secondary objectives as well, like behind enemy lines and stuff like that. And even scout the enemy too. If you go second, you can use scout the enemy on a unit of Swooping Hawks in their backlines fairly easily. And really it's the same thing with Vipers. They can hide easily, they can grab isolated objectives, and can perform movement blocks, limiting your opponent's ability to move uncontested. And one of my favorite strategies as of recently with Vipers against Necrons is actually to launch an assault on them on turn 1. So basically what happens is Necrons get a 6-inch pregame move before the game starts. So if you go first, they will have their pregame move, and this will actually put the Viper into a position where you can assault in, and some of their units won't be on the objectives yet. So you can actually tie up a unit of Necron warriors and force them to either A, stay there for probably, honestly, 3 turns of combat. Or B, fall back, and then your Viper can just go after something else if it survives. Now, you won't be able to do this against every opponent because some opponents are just going to have a model in that unit that's going to tear your Viper apart in close combat. But against a lot of opponents that are basically just shooty units that have no kind of combat ability, your Viper can actually survive, which is insane. So you can actually use the Viper to charge into enemy units to prevent them from getting on objectives in the first place, and your enemy is going to have to waste more resources trying to get on that objective. So very easy and cheap way to control the board. And pretty much if you want to give this Viper a scatter laser, it only costs 40 points. So it's not that much of an investment, and oftentimes it can mean the difference between winning a game early and losing a game. And lastly, we have striking scorpions and rangers using advanced positions. So rangers can use their advanced positions to screen out enemy reinforcements or other advanced position units, or potentially block enemy movement. So against those new Imperial Guard Scout Sentinels, you're going to want to place your rangers really close to objectives that you think the Scout Sentinels might want to get close to, so you can get the upper hand there. Just make sure that if you do, you get first turn so you can maneuver accordingly. And striking scorpions can use advanced positions to alpha strike key targets in the beginning of the game and dictate the flow of the battle, or be placed back in strategic reserve to threaten a flank or counterattack where needed later in the game. So, and this is something I didn't really mention, but reserves can also be used to deter an opponent in the first couple of turns, at least until turn 3, from getting on certain objectives and stuff like that. Because oftentimes there is an objective that's going to be in range of a strategic reserve unit coming in and shooting, or maybe even getting into close combat. Something like striking scorpions can come in and with the Strands of Fate dice can have a pretty realistic chance of getting into close combat, especially if you have Ghost Walk in your back pocket. You can definitely use this to get the scorpions into combat if you don't get first turn and they're not able to get an alpha strike off in the beginning of the game. So obviously, of course, having tools like this in your back pocket can prevent enemies from wanting to get and place their units on certain parts of the board. So what do you have to watch out for, though, when trying to control the board as Craftworld Eldar? Because we are a rather squishy faction, and we do have kind of a more difficult time holding ground and basically being able to take damage, right? So what you have to watch out for is fast enemy units that can overwhelm you quickly. So enemies like Dark Eldar, who can get up to you really fast and overwhelm key units quickly, can really put a damper on your game plan. So make sure your swooping hawks are well out of line of sight of enemy units. Make sure that your D cannons are placed correctly and that they're out of line of sight and that they, can't draw line of sight to you in the first couple of turns, or have some Strands of Fate dice saved to make those saves against those Dark Lances, etc., etc. Or of course, like I previously stated, make sure that you have ranger units that can be set up to screen out potential threats. Next, of course, you want to prevent mass enemy reinforcements, especially from armies like demons. So again, keep your forces screened well and have forewarned ready, and you should be fine. And lastly, massive artillery. So the new Imperial Guard might just be chock full of efficient, deadly, ignores line of sight units like mortars. It certainly seems that way with the new Imperial Guard Codex. So keep a lookout for that. I think most people are kind of smitten right now with Leman Russ battle tanks and Sentinels and Rough Riders and things like that. But I'm telling you, I'm looking at their book and I'm kind of seeing there's, a lot of potential for an artillery type army to do very well in this meta. And the reason why is because with so much obscuring terrain and the fact that Imperial Guard, as of yet, still have the ability to ignore the indirect fire nerf, they're going to be in a very strong position, especially things like basilisks, wyverns, mortars, things like that can benefit from orders, are going to be extremely deadly to units like swooping hawks. So do watch out for that. You do want to be prepared for that, to have a fast response to deal with their backlines. So something you could do against this, I've been kind of brainstorming on what to do if I go against something like an Imperial Guard, artillery style company with maybe 6 Earthshaker cannons or 6 basilisks or something like that. Obviously something ridiculous, some sort of spam that's meant to get rid of, anything hiding out of line of sight. What you could do is you could use your Phantasm ability to move things like D cannons into strategic reserve so that they can come in on board edges on turn 2. And what this will basically do is this will put them in range of those artillery batteries so that during your turn you can light them up. And 3 D cannons versus 3 basilisks, I hate to say it, I'm sorry, but the 3 D cannons are just going to obliterate those basilisks. Out of line of sight or not, they're going to completely obliterate them. So especially if you have 2 units of them, it should be no problem to kill and wipe those out. And also, luckily, Imperial Guard infantry is rather easy to clear off. So if they do try to screen your units outside of reserve, let's say they put some Imperial Guardsmen on the board edge, try to kind of screen you out, it would be an easy thing for you to do during the first turn to just kill those off fairly quickly. Guardsmen basically are very squishy, and you can have something like Shroud Runners or something like Warp Spiders or Swooping Hawks just come in and definitely obliterate those guys. So shouldn't be too much of a problem. So I'm thinking in those cases against massive artillery, using strategic reserve could be a way to get around that. Okay, and as promised, here's an example of how to position your forces and control the board. So this mission is called Abandoned Sanctuaries, and it's part of the Nephilim expansion. So let me go ahead and run you through what we got here. So the board has 5 objectives, and it has horizontal deployment. So you have 12-inch deployment on your board edge, and the enemy has 12-inch deployment on their board edge horizontally. So those dotted lines there represent your deployment zone and, of course, the enemy's deployment zone as well. The green circles with the stars on them represent objectives. There are 5 objectives in this mission. And this is a terrain setup that my local gaming group uses. We usually use the same terrain setup almost every game, but basically it involves 2 pieces of medium-sized obscuring terrain in the form of ruins and 2 pieces of large obscuring terrain in the form of ruins as well. And then we just kind of have a mix of light and dense cover across the board, fairly symmetrical to each other, give or take, as to not give any one player an unfair advantage in terrain. So, the Eldar are going to be in dark red, and the Space Marines are going to be in light blue. So basically, this kind of setup will give you the maximum amount of board control when deploying. So on the left-hand side, behind the big ruin on the Eldar side, I have 2 units of 3 D cannons. They're marked there with DC. I have a Viper to the left of the D cannons, a unit of Swooping Hawks hiding behind the D cannons. And again, just in case you guys also weren't aware, obscuring terrain is, all well and good, but Swooping Hawks are actually a little bit smaller than D cannons, so they can kind of hide behind them as well, just in case your enemy tries to kind of get line of sight on them or something like that. They do have the chance of being concealed by the actual physical bodies of the D cannons. And then we have a couple of Psychers in the form of Farseers and Warlocks supporting the D cannons on the left-hand side. We actually have 2 Warlock Skyrunners and a Farseer. And on the right-hand side of our board, we have a unit of 5 Shroud Runners. We have a Wave Serpent with Howling Banshees and Fire Dragons in it. And we have a couple of Farseers and 1 Warlock. So in total, we have 3 Warlock Skyrunners. We have 3 Farseers, and this is a Uthway list. That's why I'm running so many Farseers. And the troops on the left-hand side of the board in the light cover, dense cover, and light cover in the middle are Rangers. So those small little dots you see on the middle of the board, on the Eldar deployment zone, as well as the bottom left and the middle left, are Ranger units that are basically just there to prevent deep striking and stuff like that. So in this enemy army, my opponent is someone who I've played quite a few times, so I don't know his exact list, but I kind of put together what I remembered. So my opponent usually brings 2 squads of Eradicators, he usually brings several units of Primaris Space Marines, and he brings several Rhinos, as well as a Redemptor Dreadnought. And in reserves, My opponent likes bringing Vanguard veterans, the combat versions of those, so that he can kind of, use them as a counter assault unit or sweeper unit if needed. Okay, so with this setup, we basically deployed, and here's the thing. Those transparent arrows that you see there pointing out from our units are the threat ranges of those respective units. So in this particular game, if my opponent comes anywhere near those arrows, he's basically inviting the D-cannon to shoot at them. And on the other side of the board, we're using the Shroud Runners and the Wave Serpent with Howling Banshees and Fire Dragons to basically deter the opponent from getting on those objectives. So Eldar aren't very good at holding objectives, but they are good at sweeping enemies off them. So if you look at the board state on turn 1, you can already kind of see what my opponent is trying to do. So my opponent is trying to go for a basically right hand, well, I guess our right side of the board, right, is trying to go for that objective. He has 3 rhinos set up on that side. One of the rhinos is kind of more in a flexible position to go towards the middle if he needs to, but you got 2 rhinos set up with Primaris Marines filled inside of them and 2 Eradicator squads set up for support. Now he wants to take that right-hand objective on the right side of the battlefield. And knowing this, I have set up 2 units, well, 2 key units, I should say, Shroud Runners and the Wave Serpent, of course, with Howling Banshees and Fire Dragons inside. Now, the Howling Banshees and Fire Dragons are not going to try to take that objective on the right side. I'm going to cede that to my opponent. I'm going to let him have that. He just has way too many units on that side of the board for me to actually be able to deal with them. However, here's the thing, right? I'm going to let him have that objective for the most part, but I am going to use the Banshees and the Fire Dragons to contest it. So I'm going to use them to kind of mess with him a little bit on that side to make sure that he can't score too many primary points on that objective while he's trying to hold it. So essentially the game plan here is when he moves up his rhinos and disembarks his troops onto that objective, or doesn't disembark them, just leaves them in the rhino, the Fire Dragons will come out, destroy the rhino, and the Banshees will clean up the mess. And then, if he doesn't disembark the other unit, the Banshees will be in a position to actually score points on that objective. So what he's going to have to do in return is kill those Banshees, which is going to be kind of difficult if the Banshees are engaged in close combat. He'll essentially have to waste a lot of resources dealing with those 2 units. So that's what the right-hand side of the board is about. The Shroud Runners are really just there to pick off enemy units in the middle of the board who might actually try to get on the middle or rear objective. So in this particular game, I actually had the plan to move my Shroud Runners out to the left-hand side of that ruin and take pot shots at the unit on his home objective in his deployment zone. And the reason I wanted to do this was because I wanted him to waste units trying to keep his home objective secure. So if you guys don't know this already, basically in this particular mission, if you don't control your home objective by the end of your turn, you lose 1 victory point. So the goal with the Shroud Runners was to move them up to the left-hand side of that ruin, shoot the unit on the other side of the battlefield controlling his home objective, kill that unit, and then kind of slide back behind the ruin. And this would allow me to control, or, at least partially control, where my opponent was delegating his resources. Okay, so then there's that, right? And of course, they're near a farseer, so if he tries to use his Vanguard veterans to try to deep strike in, the Shroud Runners are just going to light them apart, right? I mean, Vanguard veterans are tough, but they're not really that tough, especially to something like a guided unit of Shroud Runners using Forewarned. Now, that is what I'm doing to disrupt my opponent. However, I'm also playing a very tight board control game because on the left-hand side of the board, I'm actually using my 2 units of D-cannons who are going to probably move up a little bit to the left, not too much, but a little bit to the left. They're going to be used to control the left-hand 3 objectives. So the left-hand objective on my left side, my home objective, which I'm just going to keep kind of safe with the D-cannons. If he tries to use a Vanguard veteran squad to take out those Rangers, I have a Forewarned ability right there where I can use to basically use my D-cannons to shoot those Vanguard veterans. And again, a squad of 5 Vanguard veterans is probably not going to be that hard to take out with a unit of 3 D cannons, so I have that there just in case. And the D cannons are also covering the center objective as well. So the center objective is typically what your opponent wants to do. If your opponent is fielding an army like Space Marines or Necrons or, Chaos Space Marines or something like that with a Terminator Rush, he's going to want to kind of get that center objective and control the board from there. That is because those factions are typically very tough and can survive a lot of firepower. But the advantage that Eldar have is that we do a lot of damage as a faction. So if your opponent doesn't have a way to deal with those D cannons in the back or those Howling Banshees and Fire Dragons with the Wave Serpent, basically you're going to control the board from here. So just to reiterate, on the left-hand side, we have 3 D cannons basically covering 3 objectives, covering our home objective, the left-hand objective, and the middle objective. So if our opponent wants to try to take any of those, he's going to take significant damage with those 2 batteries. On the right-hand side of the board, we have basically Howling Banshees and Fire Dragons who are just meant as disruption to try to dislodge enemy units off the right-hand objective. So, as for his deep striking units, he really has nowhere to go. And this is the same with any kind of army that you're fighting against, right? Now, if you're fighting against something like demons, you might need to screen your left side or right side a little bit better so you don't get charged. But in general, it's just not going to be really a great trade for your opponent either way. So, and also the thing is, demons typically charge a lot easier when they're not charging units in their deployment zones. So, good news for you, if you stay in your deployment zone with your D cannons, typically demons don't have a great chance of getting in there, especially if you have stuff, again, like Forewarned, or if he tries to go after your Shroud Runners, you have Wire Weave Grenades, you have Overwatch, you have all these tools to deal with it. And this is really where Eldar are powerful in controlling the game and making sure you have answers to every one of your opponent's maneuvers. So let me tell you how this game went really quick, because it was, to be honest with you, he put up a good fight. But in a situation like this, there's really not much you can do. And I get it. Space Marines, he plays actually Ultramarines, so Ultramarines are not the most competitive army right now. In fact, Space Marines are probably, one of the worst factions. Generic Space Marines, that is, from the, book. There are a few strong factions that have won tournaments and stuff like that, but this is Ultramarines. I guess recently they did win a tournament, but anyway, this is how this game went. So, turn 1 went to him, and he tried to move out. He knew that he needed to take the objectives. He basically just parked himself with several units right outside of my D cannon's range of 24 inches. And basically just told me, well, I'm going to force you to move because that's all I can really do. I can't just sit here. I'm going to force you to move up your D cannons and maybe I can take some out from there. That was his game plan, basically, in the first couple turns. Sacrifice a couple rhinos, maybe sacrifice some Primaris Marines, get on the objectives, and secure them. He took some shots at some Rangers. He killed on the left-hand side. You see those Rangers there. He killed a couple Rangers out of that unit, firing some bolters. And that's basically it. He didn't unload his guys yet. He didn't think that was a smart move, so he didn't do it. His Redemptor Dreadnought just kind of remained hidden behind terrain. He didn't really want to sacrifice that yet. And basically, he just shuffled his units around. Okay, so here's what I did in response. I couldn't really do much except for just, to be honest with you, try to stall him from getting on the objectives. So I actually did just move up one unit of D cannon slightly on the left-hand side of the board. This put me in range to make a couple of D cannon shots. Not all the D cannons in range, but a couple of them in range. And this way, I was actually able to preserve, having to use a fire and fade or something like that. And I destroyed the Rhino on the left-hand side of the board. The Swooping Hawks went forward, shot at the Primaris Marines that were in that Rhino, did some damage, and then sky leaped. On the right-hand side of the board, my Shroud Runners went out around that ruin and did exactly what I told you guys in the beginning they were going to do. They took shots at the Primaris Marines on his objective in that dense cover on his side of the board and his center objective. And of course, with the help of Guide, wiped them out. On the right-hand side of the board, I really didn't do much. I just repositioned my Wave Serpent a little bit closer to the ruin just to make sure that I had the threat range so that when he actually did disembark from his transports on turn 2 onto that objective on the right, I'd be in a position to come in and basically wipe them out. And this was basically the plan. I wanted to limit the amount of primary points he could score on the right-hand side of the board. I knew that he was going to eventually get that side because Howling Banshees basically can only survive a couple turns. Even if you use Horrify, even if you support your units on that side, if you're using them for a denial purpose, they're probably only going to be able to kill a couple units and then get overwhelmed, which is what happened in this game. But after he basically went on the objective with his Rhinos, I moved out with my Fire Dragons, took a shot at them. And now the cool thing about this was the Fire Dragons really, because they had the Exarch power, the 16-inch range Exarch power, they really didn't have to expose themselves to enemy shooting. So they were alive more than one turn. I basically moved forward, shot at 16 inches, and then battle focused back. I got a pretty good battle focus roll, and I was actually able to get back behind the ruin. Which won't always happen, by the way. Sometimes you'll whiff on the battle focus and you'll be like 17 inches out or something like that, and it won't be great for your Fire Dragons. But again, my opponent had bigger troubles to worry about. So, and plus, really, realistically, the Fire Dragons in that game were just killing Rhinos, which isn't really that big of an investment for him, so he didn't think that was a big deal. Rhinos are about 80 points, so Fire Dragons trading into them isn't the greatest, but over the course of a couple turns, if they survive, they can still make up a lot of their value. So he basically went over there, put his Rhinos on the objective, Fire Dragons blew one up, Howling Banshees went out, charged that unit, consolidated into the other Rhino and got into combat with that. And that was basically turn 2. Or I should say it was my turn 1 and it was his turn 2 after that. So what did he do after that? Well, basically, at this point in the game, he kind of had to make a lot of bad decisions. So this is where board control comes in, right? On the right-hand side of the board, he knew he had to secure that objective. But on the left-hand side of the board, he really didn't have anything that could secure the left-hand objective without taking heavy casualties. And basically what I did on the left was I moved up my Viper onto the objective. And I basically just challenged him to come out with something. So I kind of knew that he didn't quite have the tools with the 2 Primaris squads that were in that Rhino and in the ruin. So basically, if you guys don't play Space Marines have this thing where they can combat squads. So he actually had multiple combat squads in battle. That's why he has so many transports. And there was basically just 5 Marines in each one of those Rhinos. It wasn't like they were stacked full of Primaris or anything. Right? Because you might be looking at that and saying, whoa, he's way over points, but he actually wasn't. He just had 5 Marines in each Rhino. And essentially, on the left-hand side, I knew that he probably wouldn't be able to kill a Viper with just that. And because I'm playing Uthway, I specifically saved the Strands of Fate dice because I knew he had a Melt-A-Gun in one of those Primaris squads. So basically saved that. Now, as chance would have it, he actually missed with his Melt-A-Gun. So my Viper went on the objective. He did try to get out and basically contest that objective and destroy the Viper. He tried to destroy the Rangers. The Rangers ended up dying, but the Viper survived. And here's the thing. Basically what that meant was that he was unable to secure that left-hand objective on time. So my D-cannons, in response, blew up his dudes. And now he was forced to use his Redemptor Dreadnought to shoot at something. And guess what? He did. He moved forward with his Redemptor Dreadnought in the following turns, destroyed the Viper that was on there. And here's the thing. It didn't even matter at that point. Because at that point in the game, I was able to secure my Rangers on the left-hand side, move them up a little bit more, and capture that objective. And meanwhile, right, my Shroud Runners are keeping units off the middle objective that he has. He actually had to use that one Rhino on the right-hand side of the board, on the back left-hand side of the ruin. You see that one nearest his center objective? He had to zoom that over to his objective so that he would not lose command points, right? And he just kept his Marines in there. He said, okay, well, Shroud Runners probably won't be able to deal with a tank, which was a smart move. The other units in his army were struggling pretty bad, and basically at this point in the game, he tried to use his Vanguard veterans to wipe out the Howling Banshees on his own objective on the right-hand side, which, again, were still tied in combat with the Rhino. He ended up falling back with the Rhino and shooting the Banshees, which was the good move, but again, this was causing so much disruption that he wasn't able to secure this objective and get the take and hold points for it. So he was in really a lot of trouble. And meanwhile, I'm scoring on Warp Ritual. I'm scoring on Psychic Secondaries. And, you know, I'm racking up secondary victory points, right? My D cannons are preventing him from getting on the center objective reliably, which is basically, if you know this mission, it's the main thing. You really need to hold this. And because I was going to go second, because I went second, I knew that I had this in the bag, basically. Because what was going to happen was, at the end of his turn 5, he was going to move a unit on there, probably from a Rhino or something like that. His plan was he was going to basically do this, which is kind of smart. He was going to leave the Rhino on his center objective right there. And during his turn 5, he was going to disembark the Primaris Marines from there and just make a sprint towards the objective, which is very possible with a good advance roll and everything, and with the 3-inch deployment that they get, it's very possible for you to actually make that. So that's what he did, which was a smart move. He got on the objective. Unfortunately, it just wasn't really enough because I went second, and my Swooping Hawks were able to get on that objective after the D cannons finished off those Primaris Marines. So it was a really easy 1-2 maneuver. You just blow up the thing on the objective with the D cannons. In this case, it was just kind of overkill. I just wiped them out. The D cannons at that point had nothing really to shoot at. In turns previous, they had already killed the Redemptor Dreadnought by just moving up slightly. And basically, yeah, that was it. Turn 3 rolls around. I have 3 objectives. I have my own objective controlled. He never really was able to kill the Rangers on the back end, which is kind of hard because the only thing that could have realistically shot at them was the middle units in the middle of the battlefield. And something I've told my opponent a couple times is you might want to invest in something that ignores line of sight that can clear these units out, something like a Whirlwind. But he's of this mindset that Whirlwinds are just terrible because of the indirect fire rules and stuff like that. And Thunder Cannons aren't the greatest because of the same reasons. And I kind of understand his reasoning there. The indirect fire rules do kind of hurt base Space Marines a lot, but I don't know, you need something to deal with that. And I think I keep trying to tell him that, but you know, he's trying to make a really competitive list. He's trying to run in tournaments with Ultramarines and win with them, but unfortunately, so far, he just has a really hard matchup against Eldar, it looks like. So anyway, not to go too off topic of that, but basically this is the gist of being able to control the board, right? You set up a position where you have 3 objectives covered by your D cannons, or 2 objectives. Basically, your goal is this: cover at least half the objectives on the board with your D cannons. That way, you can make sure that no matter what, you can keep enemies off from holding those objectives. And with the other side of the board, or the other objectives your opponent has, use units like Howling Banshees, Fire Dragons to disrupt those units and force them off of those objectives. So sometimes it depends on the board state as well. It depends on the deployment, but this is really what you want to do. There's 2 key things here. 1, you want to deploy your units behind some obscuring terrain. 2, you want to be able to be in range of objectives so that if your opponent gets on those objectives, you have quick, easy solutions to destroy those units. And this is basically what I have here, right? Oh, and the reserves, right? The reserves, I had some Striking Scorpions in reserve. They really didn't do a whole lot. I think they ended up coming in on turn 3, and I just charged into that unit in light cover on the right-hand side. It was funny because he thought he had put them out of range, but I used the Strands of Fate, and they made a decent charge roll. I really had nothing to do with them, to be honest. Because the rest of my army was performing pretty well, so, you know, they didn't really get a lot of use. By turn 3, the units on his left-hand side of the board weren't really a problem anymore, so, you know, it was just one of those things. But yeah, basically that's the gist of it, right? That's board control, being able to cover multiple objectives with threats. And again, these don't have to be D cannons. If you are running a Beal-Tan list, this can easily be something like Howling Banshees or Fire Dragons, right? This can even be Fire Prisms, hiding behind a obscuring piece of terrain that you know you can pop out with one, shoot, and then vectored engines back in behind terrain again. And again, really competitive players will tell you that their models are too big, that it's not that easy to hide two of them. But honestly, if you're just playing at your game shop, typically you're going to have a decent sized piece of terrain. In our games, I know we have two big pieces of terrain on the board. Maybe in tournaments, they don't have bigger pieces of terrain, or you can't really guarantee that they're going to have a lot of terrain on the board. So it's a little bit different in that scene. But, if you're playing, with a group, or you're playing at the hobby shop or something like that, you should have a big piece of terrain on the board typically. And that's good for both sides. So a couple of Fire Prisms could easily hide behind something like that and perform a similar role to the D cannons, even though I think the D cannons have better damage for the cost. And they're just better in Uthway because of the, Black Guardian stratagem and stuff like that. And for Beal-Tan, you have a lot of great tools with Howling Banshees and Striking Scorpions and stuff like that Uthway doesn't. So, in this particular list, the strength is in the D cannons and Shroud Runners. But in a Beal-Tan list, the strength would probably be more in the Howling Banshees, Fire Dragons, and Striking Scorpions and stuff like that. So you can definitely set something like that up with Beal-Tan as well, to be able to deny large board spaces from your enemy using reserves and fast-moving units like Vipers. So I hope this diagram has helped you kind of get an idea of how to position your troops to control the board. In this particular game, again, it wasn't against an extremely tough opponent. It wasn't against, something like demons or something like that. But even against the demon army, I think, as long as you screen out your troops, like if I deployed this against a demon army, I would still be pretty confident that I could win that game, because I'm deploying my units in such a way that he can't really get into deep strike range easily. And once he is able to get in deep strike range, we have overlapping ways to deal with him, with Forewarned, with Overwatch, and stuff like that. So again, this can work against really any enemy army that is focused on taking objectives, which is basically everything out there, right? Unless you're going against a mirror match of other Eldar, you're going to be going against people who want to take objectives, or maybe Dark Eldar, right? Which I also think could be a little bit tricky just because they're very fast. And again, Dark Eldar don't really like to take objectives in the same way that Eldar do. But, basically all the same rules apply. Your opponent still has to get out there and take those objectives at some point. So, and the cool thing about facing Dark Eldar is they're not very tough. So if they do get a couple of raiders on an objective and you still have your D cannons online, which you should, your D cannons can easily blow them up, and then you can kill the Coprolite warriors or racks that are inside, because, Eldar are really good at killing things, and racks, even though they're tough, they're not so tough that they can't be killed with scatter lasers. So that's basically how Craftworld Eldar want to control the board. That's how Craftworld Eldar like to play the game. They like to control enemies' movements and use basically denial tactics to stop enemies from scoring on primary objectives. All right, so that's going to be it for this diagram and example. So in conclusion, Craftworld Eldar, again, may not be good at holding objectives, but they excel at target elimination and board control. And this is how you want to play your Craftworld Eldar. You don't want to try to hold objectives with them unless you're running a Wraith list or something like that. You really don't want to hold objectives. Again, the only thing that's good at holding objectives is Wraiths, and arguably they're not the best at it, even though they can work. I know that Wraith Blades with Force Shields can actually hold pretty decent, with things like Protect and Conceal and, basically stuff like that, right? But anyway, in most cases, you're not going to be wanting to hold objectives. And with the right positioning, if you have the right positioning on the battlefield, where you're covering your objectives, but also making sure that you're not vulnerable to things like deep strike and fast-moving assault units and stuff like that that can take out your D cannons and backline elements, Craftworld Eldar have more than enough tools to dictate how your opponent moves and set the pace of the battle. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today's video. I hope it was helpful. I hope I explained it right for you guys so you can kind of understand how to control the board with different Eldar units. And again, you don't have to have the exact same list I ran. That's not what I'm saying. But you can have something either similar to that work just as well, or you can have something completely different like an aspect warrior centric list, as long as you're using those denial tools and using threat ranges to prevent your enemy from getting on objectives. And if they do get on the objective, right, you have the tools to deal with them. You have the tools that you're in your arsenal to deal with them, like fire dragons if it's a tank, or howling banshees if it's infantry. And of course, striking scorpions never hurt too, either to make a first turn charge and disrupt your opponent from there, or to wait in strategic reserve and again act as another buffer unit that your opponent has to worry about on the flanks of the battle. All right, that's going to be it for today. I'll see you guys later. Again, as always, leave a comment in the comment section if you guys have something that you want to say. Leave a comment or just want to add to, the conversation that we're having about board control. So, all right, everybody, peace out. See you guys next time. Have a good one.